Welcome to M&A Talk, the #1 podcast on all things related to mergers and acquisitions. Brought to you by Morgan and Westfield.
What do you think is one of the biggest challenges in terms of working with sellers of companies? Myself, as a M&A advisor, have been working with sellers for 20 years, and certainly it has its fair share of challenges as an M&A advisor. But on the corporate development side, when you're approaching these sellers, what do you think some of the top challenges are?
Yeah, I bet you've seen, as your experience is a multiple in years of my own, I'm sure you've seen more than I, but I think there's a big psychological component. You know, if I consider leaving what I've been doing just 5 years, it has broad implications for me and my family. The windfall that would come from a sale of a business and the potential change to lifestyle for someone who potentially founded it and has been doing it for 10 or 20 plus years. That's just a huge thing for sellers to grapple with. And again, I try to be as transparent as possible. I advise my team the same. You know, we all hold ourselves to an extremely high ethical standard, but we just don't know the other side ultimately. And so, trying to be helpful and consultative around that life change from the other side and trying to help sellers, respond to that is tricky.
What's your advice to a seller in that situation? And certainly, yes, I've experienced a fair number of business owners in that situation where some almost have a breakdown just because it's such an emotional process, especially if they've owned the business for decades and it's their baby. But what's your advice to someone like that?
Yeah, I think while it works against my interests, frankly, for folks to take their time, and in the long run, it's helpful to me and my team too, because if a group isn't ready or an individual isn't ready to sell the business, particularly if there's a family dynamic that might be difficult, take time to figure it out. Culligan is, in this for the long haul in our case, and so it's best that happen, and seek the advice of those that you trust, and wherever that might come from. I think another element that I touched on before with respect to price that I wanted to get into, to the extent possible, and I guess I'm speaking for myself, but I think I speak for strategic acquirers in general. I think it's important to recognize, especially if an acquirer is looking to a partnership post-close, such as I've described in the course of this call, where the team is staying on some of the brands and some of the key elements of the business are important to the success of the acquisition, which is pretty typical, frankly. In the strategic world, I think it's important for the seller to recognize that the buyer, me in this case, is not really an adversary. I certainly do not view sellers as adversarial when it comes to price discussions. There's a give and take. There's a market for companies. There's, some markets are more efficient than others. But Culligan's objective here, certainly, and again, I think I speak for many strategic acquirers, is not to extract price. It's not where we get our value by dinging sellers and taking advantage of the information asymmetry, because it would be so destructive post-close and reputationally. And so the extent that a seller can kind of get that monkey off the back, so to speak, and not, you want to be wary, you want to go in with eyes open and not be fleeced. But that's certainly, I think, less of a concern than sellers might perceive it to be.
What do you say to the competitor that you're trying to acquire, and they're really worried that you just want to steal their competitive information? And of course, we get approached by sellers all the time saying, a competitor approached me. I'm really, really nervous talking to these guys.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate concern. Again, it really depends. I can speak for Culligan and with a lot of pride, but I think it's wise to err on the side of caution, redact things. Again, I think a company that's looking to acquire feels, that there's certainly duty-bound non-disclosure and non-circumvent stuff that one would hope would be put in place. But outside of all that, and really setting aside the enforceability of that, the reputational harm that would come out of approaching a target that's competitive and then trying to steal customers or technology, people, isn't worth it for any business that's got a long-term programmatic M&A approach. If it's a one-off, I guess, if you are approached by a competitor that's never acquired before and it doesn't have any kind of track record, I might take a little bit of a sideways glance. But again, I don't want to cast aspersions.
So what would you say to the seller that asks for references or some other form of validation if they're not aware about the acquisitions that you've made?
Yeah, I mean, in our case, it's just really a fortunate dynamic, as I referenced before, because there's just a list as long as my arm, and I put it out, and I don't even make intros. I say, just call whomever you want. Here's a list. Here's the kinds of companies. But I think there's a certain degree of external diligence that a seller can do on a potential buyer. There's, other industry players will know. I would think companies that compete with businesses that have been acquired, companies that are in the same geography, maybe they were passed over. Maybe the buyer looked at doing a deal with them, and either the business didn't want to sell to the buyer or vice versa. That can be very illuminating about how a buyer behaves. So maybe just talking to peers, I recognize that may not be number one on an owner's to-do list if they're considering selling their business, calling competitors and saying, hey, what do you think? But there's always different geographies if it's a global player.
M&A Talk is brought to you by Morgan & Westfield, a nationwide leader in mergers and acquisitions for small to mid-market companies. If you've enjoyed this show, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. Learn more at morganandwestfield.com. While we take reasonable care to select recognized experts for our podcast, please note that each podcast presents the independent opinions of such experts only, and not of Morgan & Westfield. We make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information provided. Any reliance on the podcast information is at your own risk. The podcast is for general information only and cannot be considered legal or professional advice.